Okay, so with our understanding of employment at will, we're going to transition into the next chunk of this chapter, and that's employment law. Okay, so um, several pieces of legislation, I should say, here are relating to employment law. The first two really relate to transacting with the government, and then the third is perhaps, well, not perhaps, definitely the most sweeping piece of legislation related to labor, and that stands as a valid statement up through today. All right. So Davis-Bacon Act, 1931. Government construction contractors and their subcontractors must pay prevailing wages to their employees. All right. Um, so really it amounts to average wages based on the location. This does not require a permanent raise be given if the labor force, the contractor or the subcontractor's labor force, works on non-government contracts at a lower rate. But the employees must make at least the prevailing wage while working on government contracts. So what it amounts to is employees might get a bump in pay for the time spent working on government contracts. All right, and that's assuming that the rate is their usual rate of pay is lower. All right, Wash-Healy Act, minimum wage for government contracts. I think that's currently because it's indexed. In 36 it wasn't, but in the current day, I think that's $10.10. It may be 10 and a quarter by now. It's indexed. It changes periodically, but there's a minimum wage for government contracts, and government contractors have to supply overtime pay to their employees. Right. Now, this one targeted manufacturers and suppliers, companies who manufacture or supply goods to the federal government, whereas Davis-Bacon was really targeted at construction contracts. All right. And Wash-Healy was in 36. And we see a lot of labor legislation, labor laws in the 1930s. And so just placing this in a historical context, we're in the Depression, right? Because the market crashed in 1929, which led to the Great Depression, which tended to favor employers' interest against employee interest. It tended to drive wages down. Work was a privilege when you could get it, and accordingly, wages were low, hours were long, conditions were poor, and dangerous. Okay, so the result was these pieces, and there were others, but these are the ones we're studying, these pieces of labor law. All right, and so the most sweeping is the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, to be clear, this was targeted for your blue-collar working class population. It was not written to protect professionals, doctors, managers, people who are, at least in theory, sophisticated enough to negotiate their own employment agreements. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about Fair Labor Standards Act. All right. Um, Prohibition of child labor. All right, so prior to this act, there really was no limit on the type of work that you could have children do. All right, so after the Fair Labor Standards Act, children under 14 are limited in what they can do. I think it includes paper routes, working in family businesses, entertainment, so they can be child actors, and a few other things, but limited jobs, right? And that's enforced today. Under 16, so between 14 and 16, so to speak, your hours are limited. In most states, I think it's you can't work after 7 p.m. if you're not 16. And you have to be enrolled in school. So the work permit is issued by the school. So we're allowing children to work, or I should say children below the age of 16 to work, but not instead of being in school. All right. Under 18 can't work in hazardous conditions, coal mines, anything with blasting, any inherently dangerous occupation. Can't do that under 18. And once you reach 18, have at it. All right, so that's how it works. All right, minimum wage, which I believe in 1938 was, I believe, 15 cents per hour. It's indexed and it does change periodically. It is currently 7 1/4. All right, it is, and that's federal, but the way the law is written, it does allow for states and localities to articulate a higher minimum wage, and that then does take precedence. So you may be aware, minimum wage in the state of Ohio, $8.55, I believe. All right. Tipped workers can be paid below minimum wage, $2.13, but if on a particular shift their hourly, they don't earn enough tips to earn at least a minimum wage, then the employer is legally required to kick in the difference. All right. And that is the way the law is written. Typically, when I talk about this in a classroom, you know, there's some waitress who was unaware, but that is the law. So if you earn less than in the state of Ohio, it would be $8.55 per hour. When you factor in tips, your employer is obligated to cover the difference between what you actually earn per hour and the minimum wage. Okay. Fair Labor Standard also brought in the 40-hour work week. Prior to that, there really was no cap. And I guess there's really still no cap, but it cost employers more, which serves as motivation to keep work weeks manageable. All right. I have linked part of a documentary in this week's materials in the module for this week. It's Walmart, the High Cost of a Low Price, which is a bit dated. The documentary is a bit old at this point, but it's still very relevant. And I haven't required that you guys watch the entirety of it, but if you are so motivated, there's a lot in there about overtime and things that Walmart might have done or did to avoid paying overtime legally or illegally. All right. So I encourage you to look at that if you get a chance. Overtime, and keep in mind, Fair Labor Standards Act, it's in the name. It is targeted to protect laborers who did not have, and in the 30s, unions weren't as large as they were now. So really and truly, there wasn't really any representation looking out for labor. All right, so to that end, the overtime it really only protects the labor force. It doesn't protect the executives, managers, professionals, employees who are deemed to have the sophistication to negotiate on their own behalf. All right, and those are called exempt employees. All right, so in reality, most of you will spend most of your career as an exempt employee. Doesn't mean your company can't elect to pay you overtime, but you are not legally entitled to it. Layoffs. All right. And I've got a decision tree that I've put in the slides on the next slide that I really like. It's from the Department of Labor. But let's talk a little bit about the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, or the WARN Act, which is a great acronym, right? Because it's kind of what the law requires, warning. Applicable to employers with 100 or more full-time employees. What does it do? Well, you got to give 60 days notice to when there are going to be mass layoffs. All right. Mass layoff is defined as 1/3 of a work site or 500 or more jobs company-wide. Okay, so that's what the WARN Act does. Here's your decision tree, right? And this kind of details, and this is from the Government Accountability Office, right? So this is from federal documents. So first box, employer has 100 or more full-time workers, and layoffs affecting at least 50 full-time workers will last over 6 months. So if both those are met, then we go with the yes. Is the employer closing a plant or unit? If yes, then we go, are the layoffs due to factors, strikes, lockouts, or completion of a particular product? If yes, notice is required. All right, and honestly, if no, and I wish the laser pointer was working here, or the red dot, but I don't think it is. But if we go back to, is the employer closing a plant or a unit? There we have kind of the meat. So if the number of employees to be laid off is 1/3 of the workforce or 500 workers company-wide, that's when warning has to be given. All right. Okay. Let's press on. Last piece of labor law that we'll be responsible for, Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA. Says 1993. I don't think that's the right year. I'm going to check that, and I may update that. Allows employees to take unpaid time off from work for medical or family reasons. So the way this works is that every employee, let me put it this way. If your employer has 50 or more full-time employees, you are entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid leave in a 12-month period. All right. So some things to be careful with. It is unpaid leave, so you're not entitled to 12 months with pay. You do remain benefit eligible, however. All right. While on leave, you remain benefit eligible in a 12-month period. Right. And that 12-month period is not a calendar year or a fiscal year. It starts to run from the return of your previous FMLA leave. All right. So in other words, you couldn't take 12 weeks, the last 12 weeks of a calendar year, and then take the next 12 weeks of the next calendar or fiscal year. It starts to run from the return of your return from a previous FMLA leave. All right. Qualifying events. birth, adoption, or fostering of a child, to care for an ill spouse, to care for employee's own illness, other emergencies, or military leave, which for military leave you actually get half a year, 26 weeks of military leave. What does it protect? When I get back, I get the same job at the same rate of pay. Or I should say the same type of job, because if I was a sales agent, I could have a different or less profitable geographic area. That's not illegal, right? But what it protects is my job to come back to. It does not protect workspace. So if I was sitting in a corner office when I left, and when I get back, I'm in the janitor's closet, well, that's not illegal either. All right. Let's see. One other thing I'll add. Companies are legally required, not legally required, they can legally require you to take and exhaust paid leave before your unpaid leave kicks in. So if you have vacation and or personal time off, say if you have 3 weeks that you haven't taken yet, and you apply to take 12 weeks of FMLA leave, many companies are going to have you take your vacation and then your personal time off before you take your FMLA leave. And what that does is it prevents you from taking 12 weeks for a personal matter and then coming back and going on vacation for the next 3 weeks. All right. The qualifying events. All right. And we want to construe these very broadly in favor of the employee. All right. So suffice it to say that employers who try and say that's not a qualifying event or that's not FMLA appropriate often lose in court. Right? Not all the time, but often. The case in your book, the caregiver caring for her mother, I believe, takes her mother on a trip, what amounts to a vacation as her dying wish, and the employer doesn't believe that falls under FMLA leave. Well, the court disagrees and the employer loses. Right? So it is very broadly construed. Generally, best practice is if an employee believes they have a qualifying event, generally treat them as they do, unless it's just outrageous. Okay. That's it for this piece of this chapter. We'll be back momentarily.